The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the quaint suburban neighborhood as Deborah stood in her driveway. Her eyes, usually calm and reflective, widened with surprise and delight. Before her, adorned with a giant red bow, sat a sleek, silver car, a gift from her husband, George. "Happy anniversary, Deb," George exclaimed with his characteristic wide grin, his police uniform slightly ruffled from the day's work. His eyes sparkled with mischief and affection as he handed her the car keys. Deborah, overwhelmed by the gesture, laughed. "George, it's too much. I can't believe you got me a car." He chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Well, I figured it's about time you had a car of your own. You know, for those times when my jokes about women drivers get too much for you." She playfully nudged him, her laughter mingling with his. "Oh, so it's a getaway car then? For when I can't stand your teasing?" "Exactly." George winked. "But seriously, you've been talking about getting back into driving. I thought, why not surprise you?" Deborah's heart swelled with affection. She admired the car, its sleek lines, the way the evening light danced on its silver surface. "It's beautiful, George. Thank you, I love it." She slid into the driver's seat, the leather cool and comforting against her skin. George leaned down at the window, his face lit with the satisfaction of a perfect gift. "Just promise me one thing," he said, a mock serious tone in his voice. "What's that?" Deborah asked, playing along. "That you'll drive it more carefully than you drive me crazy with your Sunday morning jazz playlists." Deborah laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet street. "No promises there, officer." With a mock salute, George stepped back, watching as Deborah started the engine. The car hummed to life, its sound a gentle promise of journeys yet to come. As she eased the car down the street, Deborah glanced back at her husband through the rearview mirror. He stood there, a figure of love and strength, his smile lingering in her mind long after he was out of sight. Little did she know, this car, this symbol of her husband's love, would soon lead her down a path of unexpected encounters and emotional revelations. It was the beginning of a story that would intertwine their lives with that of their mysterious new neighbor in ways they could never have anticipated. The evening had deepened into a velvety twilight as Deborah navigated the familiar streets of her neighborhood in her new car. She relished the quiet solitude, the smooth hum of the engine a soothing companion. The streets, lined with amber streetlights, were almost deserted, giving the suburban area a tranquil, almost dreamlike quality. As she turned onto her street, her thoughts drifted to George's playful words and the warmth of his embrace. A smile lingered on her lips, a testament to the joy that simple moments with him brought to her life. Her reverie was abruptly shattered by a sudden jarring noise. Startled, Deborah braked hard, her heart pounding. Outside, the shadows of the evening had concealed a figure until the very last moment. It was a car, a dark sedan, clumsily maneuvering into a parking space, but misjudging the distance and scraping against the side of her new car. Deborah's first instinct was a surge of annoyance, but it quickly gave way to concern as she stepped out to assess the damage. The other driver, a man she didn't recognize, also exited his vehicle. He was tall and had an air of weariness about him, his movements slow and somewhat uncoordinated. "I'm so sorry," he stammered, his voice laced with fatigue. "I didn't see your car there. It's been a long day." Deborah examined the scrape on her car. It was minor but noticeable. She looked up at the man, intending to express her frustration, but the words faltered on her lips. There was something in his demeanor, a certain vulnerability. "It's okay," Deborah said softly. "It's just a car. Are you all right?" The man seemed taken aback by her gentleness. "Yes, I think so. I'm just really tired." "It's been a rough week. I'm Mark, by the way. I just moved in a few doors down." "I'm Deborah," she replied, extending a hand. "Nice to meet you, Mark. although I wish it were under better circumstances. Mark managed a wary smile. I'll cover any repairs, of course. I can give you my insurance information. Deborah hesitated, her mind racing. George would be furious if he found out about the accident, especially with a stranger involved. But looking at Mark, something told her that this situation needed a softer touch. You know what? Let's just sort it out tomorrow, Deborah suggested. It's late, and you look like you could use some rest. Mark's eyes conveyed his gratitude. Thank you, Deborah. I promise we'll sort this out first thing in the morning. As they parted ways, Deborah couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to Mark's exhaustion than met the eye. She gazed after him as he trudged towards his house, a shadowy figure in the dim light. Her heart, usually so certain, now fluttered with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Unbeknownst to Deborah, this chance encounter was the first thread in a tapestry of events that would weave the lives of Deborah, George, and Mark together, revealing hidden depths and unexpected turns in the heart of their quiet community. The next morning, the air in the neighborhood was crisp and the sky, a clear, pale blue. Deborah had woken up early, the events of the previous evening playing on her mind. She decided to deal with the car situation before George woke up, hoping to avoid any unnecessary drama. As Deborah was sipping her coffee, contemplating how to approach Mark about the car, she heard a commotion outside. Peering through the window, her heart sank. George, in his off-duty attire, was standing by the scratched car, his posture tense and his voice raised. Mark was there too, looking more disheveled than the night before, if that was possible. Deborah hurried outside, her mind racing. "George, what's going on?" she asked. George turned to her, his face a mix of concern and anger. "This guy," he gestured towards Mark, "he hit your new car. And look at him, he's probably hungover." Mark, rubbing his temples, tried to interject, It's not what it looks like." Deborah noticed the gathering neighbors, their curious and judgmental eyes on the trio. She knew how quickly gossip spread in their small community. Taking a deep breath, she decided to intervene. "George, let's not jump to conclusions," she said calmly. "Mark and I already talked about this last night. It was an accident, and he's going to take care of it." George looked at her, then at Mark, his expression softening slightly. "Is that true?" he asked Mark. "Yes, it is," Mark replied, his voice low. "I apologize for the trouble. I'll cover all repair costs." A neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, called out from her porch. "Looks like someone had a bit too much fun last night." Deborah shot her a disapproving look before turning back to the men. "Let's not make a scene. Mark, why don't you come over later and we can discuss how to handle the repairs?" Mark nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Deborah. I'll be over as soon as I can." As the neighbors dispersed, some shaking their heads, George wrapped an arm around Deborah's shoulder, leading her back inside. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said, a hint of doubt in his voice. "I do," Deborah reassured him, though her mind was clouded with uncertainty. "It's just a car, George. And Mark seems like he's going through a tough time." George looked at her, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You always see the good in people, Deb. I just hope this guy doesn't take advantage of your kindness." Deborah smiled faintly, touched by her husband's protective nature. "I'll be careful." As they walked back into their home, Deborah couldn't help but feel a twinge of concern for Mark. There was something about his weary eyes and defeated posture that tugged at her heartstrings. Unbeknownst to her, this small act of understanding would set off a chain of events that would reveal the true nature of the mysterious new neighbor and test the fabric of their community. Later that day, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed lawns, Mark knocked on Deborah's door. He seemed more composed than before, yet there was a noticeable heaviness in his eyes. Deborah welcomed him into the living room, where George sat reading the newspaper. George looked up, his expression one of polite reserve. "Thank you for coming over, Mark," Deborah said, gesturing towards the couch. "Please, have a seat." Mark nodded and sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I wanted to apologize again for the accident and to discuss the repairs," he began, his voice steadier than it had been in the morning. George set his newspaper aside, his demeanor still guarded. "I appreciate you taking responsibility," he said, "but I have to admit, I'm curious. You seemed pretty out of it this morning." Mark exhaled slowly, a sense of resignation in his posture. "I understand why you'd think that, but the truth is, I wasn't intoxicated. I'm a doctor at the local hospital, and I've just come off a 48-hour shift. We had several emergencies, and I barely had a moment to rest." Deborah's eyes widened in surprise and empathy. "That sounds incredibly tough. I can't even imagine how exhausting that must be." George's expression softened, the initial suspicion giving way to understanding. "A doctor, huh? That's commendable work. I'm sorry for jumping to conclusions earlier." Mark managed a small smile. "Thank you. It's been a challenging week. The last thing I wanted was to cause trouble for my new neighbours." Deborah leaned forward, her innate kindness shining through. "Is there anything we can do to help? Maybe bring over some meals or anything?" Mark shook his head, his smile growing a bit more genuine. "That's very kind of you, but I'll be fine. Right now, I just want to make things right about the car." George nodded. "Let's sort out the details then. We can get a quote from the repair shop and go for it." As they discussed the logistics, Deborah couldn't help but feel a sense of relief and connection. Mark wasn't the reckless neighbour they had presumed him to be. He was a dedicated professional who had found himself in an unfortunate situation. Once they had agreed on a plan for the repairs, Mark stood to leave. "Thank you both for being so understanding," he said sincerely. "I hope I can make it up to you someday." George stood and extended a hand. "No hard feelings. We're just glad to clear things up." After Mark left, Deborah and George sat in thoughtful silence. "He's not at all what I expected," George admitted. Deborah nodded, her thoughts echoing his. "Sometimes people surprise us. I'm just glad we could understand his side of the story." As the evening settled in, Deborah reflected on the day's revelations. Little did she know, this newfound understanding would soon lead them down a path filled with more surprises and challenges, ultimately revealing the true strength and compassion. A few weeks had passed since the incident with Mark. Life in the neighbourhood had returned to its usual calm rhythm. Deborah, sitting on her porch, enjoyed the serene evening, lost in a book. The tranquility was suddenly broken by a commotion inside the house. Rushing in, she found George clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. Panic surged through her as she dropped to his side. "George." "What's wrong?" she cried, her voice trembling. I don't know. My chest, it hurts," George gasped, struggling to breathe. Deborah's mind raced. She needed help, fast. Just then, she remembered Mark, the doctor. Without a second thought, she ran out of the house towards Mark's residence. Bursting through his door, she found Mark reading in his living room, a look of surprise crossing his face as he saw her frantic state. "Mark, it's George. He's in pain. I think it's his heart," Deborah exclaimed, breathless with fear. Without hesitation, Mark sprang to his feet, following Deborah back to her house. They found George pale and sweating, barely conscious. Mark knelt beside George, his professional instincts kicking in. "George, can you hear me? I'm going to check your pulse." George groaned in response, his eyes fluttering. Mark turned to Deborah. "Call an ambulance now. I think he's having a heart attack." As Deborah hurried to call emergency services, Mark began administering first aid. He spoke calmly, trying to keep George conscious. "Stay with me, George. Help is on the way." Deborah, phone in hand, returned to George's side, her voice shaking as she spoke to the dispatcher. Tears streamed down her face as she watched Mark, once a stranger, now a lifesaver, working to stabilize her husband. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. Paramedics rushed in, taking over from Mark. As they carried George out on a stretcher, one of the paramedics spoke to Deborah. "Your neighbour did a good job. He might have just saved your husband's life." Deborah looked at Mark with a newfound sense of respect and gratitude. "Thank you, Mark. I don't know what we would have done without you." Mark, looking fatigued yet composed, nodded. "I was just at the right place at the right time. I'll come by the hospital later to check on him." After George was taken to the hospital, the neighbours, who had gathered outside, murmured among themselves, their earlier misconceptions about Mark dissolving into admiration for his swift, life-saving actions. That night, as Deborah sat beside George's hospital bed, watching him breathe steadily under the hum of medical equipment, she reflected on the day's harrowing events. Mark, whom they had once judged unfairly, had emerged as a hero in their time of need. The experience had brought an unexpected shift in their neighbourhood dynamics, turning skepticism into respect and gratitude. As George's steady breathing filled the quiet room, Deborah felt a profound sense of gratitude and connection to Mark. His actions had not only saved her husband's life, but had also woven a stronger bond of community and understanding amongst them all. In the weeks following George's heart attack, the atmosphere in the neighbourhood changed. The incident had acted as a catalyst, transforming the community's perception of Mark from a shadowy figure to a respected member. One sunny afternoon, as George, now recovering well, and Deborah sat in their garden, Mark walked by. Deborah waved him over. "Mark, come join us for a while," she called out. Mark hesitated then, with a small smile, accepted the invitation. "How are you feeling, George?" he asked as he took a seat. "Much better. Thanks to you," George replied, his tone warm. "I owe you an apology. I misjudged you when we first met." Mark waved off the apology. "It's okay, George. I'm just glad I was there to help." Deborah, sipping her tea, observed the exchange. "What you did was more than just help, Mark. You've changed how we all see each other in this community." Mark looked around, taking in the peaceful neighbourhood. "I've always believed that communities thrive on understanding and support. I'm happy to be part of such a neighbourhood now." George nodded. "You know, I was thinking, we should have a neighbourhood get-together. It'd be a great way to strengthen this bond we've started to build." "That's a wonderful idea," Deborah chimed in, excited. "A block party. We haven't had one in years." Mark smiled, visibly more relaxed. "I'd like that. It's a great way to meet everyone properly." As they discussed plans for the party, the conversation flowed easily, laughter and ideas mingling in the warm afternoon air. A few weeks later, the block party was in full swing. Neighbours who had once been strangers or mere acquaintances now chatted like old friends. George, with a new lease on life, was more relaxed and jovial than ever. Deborah watched as Mark mingled with everyone, his earlier isolation replaced by a sense of belonging. She approached him, her heart filled with gratitude. "Mark, this is all thanks to you," she said. "You've brought us all together." Mark looked around, a contented smile on his face. "It's amazing what a little understanding can do, isn't it?" Deborah nodded. "It's more than that. You've shown us the power of compassion and kindness." As the party continued into the evening, the neighbourhood was alight with a newfound harmony. Music played, children laughed, and friendships blossomed under the stars. Later, as the guests started to leave, George put his arm around Deborah. "You know, I've never seen our community this united. It feels good." Deborah just leaned into his embrace. "It does. It feels like we're part of something special." They stood together, watching as Mark said his goodbyes. A once solitary figure, now an integral part of their community tapestry. In that moment, Deborah realised the profound impact of empathy and understanding. Mark's arrival, which had once seemed like a minor disturbance, had turned out to be the key to unlocking a deeper sense of community and connection. As the night drew to a close, Deborah looked up at the stars, her heart full. The harmony of hearts in their little neighborhood was a gentle reminder of the beauty and strength found in unity and mutual respect. Months had passed since the block party, and the neighborhood had transformed into a close-knit community. One peaceful evening, Deborah and George sat on their porch, reminiscing about the recent changes. "You know, Deb," George began, his voice reflective, "I've been thinking about how everything changed after Mark moved in. It's like he brought us all together without even trying." Deborah smiled, her eyes warm with agreement. "Yes, it's incredible. It started with a simple act of kindness, and now look at us. We're more than just neighbors. We're like a family." George nodded. "It's funny how life works. You think you have it all figured out, and then something small shifts, and..." They were interrupted by a gentle voice from the sidewalk. "Hope I'm not intruding," Mark said, approaching them with his usual friendly smile. "Of course not, Mark. Come up and join us," Deborah replied, gesturing to an empty chair. Mark took a seat, looking at the couple with a sense of camaraderie. "I was just out for a walk and wanted to say how grateful I am. This neighborhood, it's become a home." Deborah's heart swelled with pride. "It's all of us, Mark. We built this together." "You were the catalyst, though," George added. "You showed us the importance of understanding and not jumping to conclusions." Mark chuckled softly. "Well, I learned a lot too. About kindness, community, and how a little empathy can go a long way." They fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their thoughts, reflecting on the journey they had undertaken together. Deborah broke the silence, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "It's like we've woven a tapestry, isn't it? Each of us adding our own thread, creating something beautiful and strong." George reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "And every tapestry tells a story. Ours is about kindness, second chances, and..." Mark looked at them, his expression one of contentment. "I couldn't have asked for a better story to be part of." As the night deepened, they sat together sharing stories and laughter, the bonds of friendship and community wrapping around them like a warm blanket. In that serene moment, under the starlight sky, the tapestry of their neighborhood, woven with threads of kindness, understanding, and mutual respect, was a testament to the power of human connection. It was a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could ripple outwards, transforming lives and bringing people together in the most unexpected and beautiful ways.